The ones born between worlds. The seam. There is a place that does not belong to any map. It is not land, nor sky, nor sea, but the thin breath between them. The seam is what the elders call it, the trembling membrane where worlds brush against one another like passing dreams. Most beings never feel it. Most worlds never touch. But sometimes the seam thins, and when it does, something impossible is born. They are called the between-born, children of two realms, carriers of clashing laws, living contradictions who breathe one world's air and bleed another's magic. They are feared, hunted, worshipped, and misunderstood in equal measure. This is their story. This is the story of the ones born between worlds. Chapter 1. Ash and Salt Kale learned early that he did not belong. He was born on the night the western sea boiled. The fishermen of Salt Reach still told the story in whispers, how the waves rose like walls of glass, how the moon cracked red across the sky, how a woman staggered from the surf carrying a newborn that glowed faintly like embers under skin. Kyle remembered none of that. What he remembered was ash. Ash falling from a clear sky when he was 6. Ash coating the docks where he played. Ash in his lungs when the fire came from nowhere and everywhere at once. The elders said it was an accident, a spark, a lantern, a careless hand. Kyle knew better. When fear clenched his chest, heat answered. When anger rose, flames followed. And when the villagers realized that the fire obeyed him, they ran. Some threw stones, others prayed. One man tried to drown him. Kyle survived only because the sea opened for him. Salt water parted like a living thing, holding him upright as if cradled by unseen arms. The man screamed and fled, convinced he had seen a demon. By dawn, Kyle was alone. He learned to walk the cliffs, to hide his fire beneath his skin, to speak to the sea without words. He learned that he could not stay. The worlds did not like mistakes, and Kyle was one. Chapter 2. Glasswing. In the high canopies of the Aralis Reach, Lyra was learning how to fall. Again, her instructor said, arms folded, wings tucked tight. You hesitate. Lyra stepped to the edge of the branch, heart hammering. Below her stretched miles of open air, threaded with floating islands and drifting pollen clouds that glowed gold in the sun. Any true Airlin child would leap without thinking. Lyra hesitated. She always did. Her wings, translucent, veined like glass, fluttered nervously. They were beautiful, everyone said. Too beautiful. Too fragile. Not feathered like the others, not strong enough. Because Lyra was not fully Airlin. Her mother had fallen from the lower world. Her father had never spoken of her. Lyra leapt. For a breathless moment, she fell. Then the air caught her. Not her wings, the air itself, thickening around her body, lifting her gently like unseen hands. Gasps rippled through the watching students. Lyra landed softly on a drifting platform, unharmed. The instructor stared. That, she said slowly, is not windcraft. Lyra folded her wings, shame burning hotter than fear. She knew. The sky listened to her in a way it did not listen to others, and that made her dangerous. Chapter 3. The Horned Scholar. Thorn had read of the Between-born long before he realized he was one. He read everything. Scrolls, tablets, forbidden codices locked behind sigils and warnings. Knowledge was safer than people. Knowledge did not flinch when it saw his reflection. Curved obsidian horns framed his temples, small but unmistakable. His eyes glowed faintly gold in the dark. His shadow sometimes moved a heartbeat slower than he did. Demonic traits, the scholars whispered. But Thorn's blood sang with celestial resonance. Impossible according to every law. He taught at the great archive of Velis, where angels debated philosophy and demons argued mathematics. Thorn existed uneasily between them, tolerated because his mind was brilliant and his demeanor gentle, until the book found him, the Codex Interstitia, a living manuscript that pulsed when he touched it, its pages rearranging themselves to form a single phrase: "The seam is breaking." Thorn closed the book with shaking hands. If the seam broke completely, worlds would collapse into one another, and the Betweenborn would be the key. Chapter 4. The Call. They dreamed of the same place, a tower made of fractured light, a voice that was many voices, a question older than creation itself. What are you? Cale woke with fire crawling across his veins. Lyra woke falling through endless sky. Thorn woke with the Codex screaming. Across worlds, the call went out, and the Betweenborn answered. Chapter 5. Convergence. They met at the edge of nowhere, a crossroads that existed only because belief held it together. Stone paths from different realities intersecting around a dead tree that bled silver sap. Kyle arrived first, flames flickering beneath his skin. Lyra descended from the sky like a shard of dawn. Thorn stepped through a glyph circle, book clutched to his chest. They stared at one another, wary, curious, afraid. "I think," Thorn said carefully, "that we are the same kind of mistake." Cale snorted. "I'm not a mistake." Lyra tilted her head. "Then what are we?" Silence. The dead tree groaned, and the worlds shifted closer. Chapter 6. Hunters of Purity. They were not alone for long. The Inquisitors came cloaked in white fire, chanting laws that scorched the air. They believed purity was survival, one world, one truth. "Abominations," their leader declared. "You tear the seams simply by existing." Cale's fire surged. Lyra's wings shattered light. Thorn raised the Codex, symbols blazing. The battle that followed bent reality. Fire that burned without heat. Wind that cut like glass. Words that rewrote the ground beneath their feet. When it ended, the crossroads was gone, and the Betweenborn were fugitives. Chapter 7. Learning each other. They traveled through broken places, worldlets stitched together by accident, forests growing upside down, oceans suspended in spheres, cities built inside the rib cages of dead gods. They learned one another. Cale learned to temper flame with Lyra's calm. Lyra learned to trust the ground through Cale's steadiness. Thorn learned that knowledge meant nothing without choice. They laughed. They argued. They began, slowly, to feel like something more than errors. Chapter 8. The Truth of the Seam. At the Fracture Tower, the place from their dreams, they learned the truth. The seam was not failing. It was evolving. Worlds were never meant to remain separate forever. The Betweenborn were not accidents. They were bridges. But bridges terrified those who feared change. To heal the seam, a choice had to be made. Not destruction, integration, emerging guided by those who could survive it. By them. Chapter 9. Sacrifice. The Inquisitors returned with armies, angels of singular light, demons of absolute shadow. Both sides united by fear. The battle at the Fracture Tower shattered stars. Kyle burned until he was light. Lyra flew until there was no sky left. Thorn spoke the final words of the Codex, knowing what they would cost. To bind the worlds gently together, something had to remain behind. A consciousness woven into the seam. A guardian. Thorn smiled as understanding dawned. "Tell them," he said softly, "we were never broken." And he stepped into the light. Chapter 10. A New Dawn. The worlds did not collapse. They softened. Borders became doorways. Difference became dialogue. Kyle stood on a shore where sea and flame danced together. Lyra flew through skies that welcomed all wings, and in the quiet between moments, the seam hummed, alive. 7 balanced, guarded by a horned scholar who watched over infinite paths. The Betweenborn were no longer hunted. They were honored. For they were not the end of worlds. They were the beginning. What are you? A child once asked Kale, eyes wide with wonder. What are you? Kale smiled, firelight warm and gentle. I'm proof, he said, that the universe is brave enough to try something new. And somewhere beyond sight, the seam agreed. Echoes of the in-between. Chapter 11. After the softening. The worlds were quieter after the seam healed. Not silent, never silent, but quieter in the way a heart sounds after surviving a storm. Kale felt it first. The fire inside him no longer fought the sea. When he walked the shoreline of the newly merged coast, waves hissed gently around his ankles, steam rising in lazy spirals instead of violent bursts. Villages stood where no village had ever stood before. Homes built of coral stone and blackened wood, their people a tapestry of forms, scaled hands, glowing eyes, wings folded awkwardly against cloaks. No one screamed when Kale passed. Some bowed. Some smiled. That frightened him more than hatred ever had, because peace was fragile, and he had learned long ago how easily fire could ruin beautiful things. Chapter 12. The sky that learned names. Lyra discovered grief had weight. It pressed against her wings when she flew too high, tugging her downward like unseen hands. The sky had changed, no longer endless, no longer distant. It bent and breathed and listened. Sometimes it spoke, not in words, but in pressure, in warmth, in currents shaped like memory. It spoke Thorn's name. Lyra landed on a floating ridge overlooking a valley where sky roots grew upward from the ground like inverted trees. Below, children practiced lifting stones with half-learned magic, laughing when gravity argued back. "They don't know," she whispered. The sky hummed. They didn't know the cost. They didn't know someone had stayed behind so they could belong. Lyra folded her glass wings around herself and vowed she would remember for them. Chapter 13. The guardian who watched Thorn no longer had a body. He was pattern and pause, question and answer. He existed as tension, holding worlds apart just enough that they could lean toward one another without collapsing. He felt everything. Every door opening where once there had been a wall. Every scream where integration went wrong. Every prayer spoken to no God at all. Some sensed him. Children born with eyes that saw too much. Scholars who dreamed of equations that breathed. A few called him Watcher, others Warden. He preferred neither. He was simply Thorn. And something was wrong. Chapter 14. Fracture Signs. The signs were subtle at first. A city that shifted a street overnight. A river that began flowing backward every third dawn. Creatures born whole, but unraveling with age. Kale felt the fire flicker. Lyra felt the air hesitate. Across the in-between, echoes rippled. Distortions not born of fear but of excess. Too much connection, too little guidance. The seam, once healed, was being pulled, not torn, harvested. Chapter 15. The Architects. They called themselves the Architects of Unity. Mortals, mostly. That was the most dangerous part. They believed the worlds could be perfected. Smoothed, standardized. No more dangerous hybrids. No unstable magic. No contradictions. Choice causes suffering, their leader proclaimed, standing within a city of mirrored stone. We will finish what the seam began. Their machines drank from the in-between, and Thorn screamed. Chapter 16. Reunion at the Edge. Kale and Lyra felt it at the same moment. Pain, not theirs, his. They converged at a place that should not exist anymore. A cliff where sky met, sea met silence. The air shimmered, folding inward. Thorn's voice reached them, not sound, but knowing. They are reshaping me. Lyra's wings flared, glass ringing like bells. They're hurting you. They're hurting everyone, Kyle said, fire darkening to molten white. For the first time since the softening, the Betweenborn chose war. Chapter 17. The Cost of Perfection. The architect's cities were beautiful. That was the lie. Symmetry without soul. Magic confined to channels. Hybrids forced into templates that erased the very tension that made them live. Kyle burned the machines, not in rage, in mourning. Lyra shattered the skies they controlled, teaching the air to be wild again. And beneath it all, Thorn unraveled their equations, rewriting balance where control had tried to take root. But every correction weakened him. He was not infinite. Chapter 18. What must change? They met one last time, in a space that was almost a room. Thorn shaped himself into light and shadow so they could see him. "I can't remain as I am," he said gently. "A single mind cannot hold evolving worlds forever." Lyra's breath caught. "Then don't be alone." Kyle understood before she finished. The Betweenborn were never meant to be bridges alone. They were meant to be many. Chapter 19. The New Weave. The choice spread, not forced, offered. Those born between worlds could anchor parts of the seam, briefly, gently, sharing the weight, not sacrifice, participation. Thorn loosened, becoming chorus instead of cage. The seam learned to breathe again. Chapter 20. The Future That Moves. Years later, stories changed. Children asked not what someone was, but where they touched. Maps became fluid. Borders became conversations. Kale taught control without fear. Lyra taught flight without falling. And in the quiet between moments, 1,000 minds watched together. Not to rule, but to listen. Because the worlds were no longer fragile things to be protected from difference. They were living systems, and the ones born between worlds were no longer exceptions. They were the proof that change could be shared. The question answered again. A child stood at a crossroads that shimmered softly. "What am I?" they asked. The seam answered, not with a word, but with a path. And the path led everywhere. The Weight of the Real, Chapter 21. When the Stars Hesitate. The first sign was not magical. That was what made it terrifying. A star went out, not exploded, not consumed, simply stopped. Astronomers across a dozen worlds recorded the same anomaly, a fixed point of light dimming into absence, leaving behind a measurable void. Gravity adjusted, tides shifted, seasons stuttered. No prophecy had warned of it, no ancient text named it. Thorn felt it as a silence where mathematics should have been. This, he realized, spreading awareness across the seam, is not a flaw in connection. This is subtraction. Chapter 22. The Null. They named it out of fear. The Null. Not an entity in the way gods were entities. Not a will, not a hunger. It did not hate existence. It simply did not acknowledge it. Worlds touched by the Null did not burn or collapse. They became irrelevant. Physics unraveled first, then memory, then meaning. Cities remained standing, but no one remembered why they were built. People lived, but forgot what living was for. It was not chaos, it was erasure, and it was coming from beyond the worlds, beyond even the seam. Chapter 23. The limits of being between the Betweenborn were the first to feel the strain. Anchoring the seam had always required balance, but now the balance pulled outward, towards something that could not be bridged. Kyle's fire no longer answered instinctively. Sometimes it burned, sometimes it failed. Lyra's wings caught air that was suddenly thin with doubt. Flight required effort now, choice. Even Thorn, distributed, shared, resilient, felt pieces of himself go numb. "The Null doesn't oppose us," he told them. "It ignores us. And that may be worse." Chapter 24. A World That Chose Not to Matter. They traveled to Helior, or what remained of it. The sun still rose. The fields were still green. But the people moved as if rehearsing lives they no longer believed in. A baker kneaded dough without knowing why hunger existed. Children played games without rules or joy. History books were blank. This was not death. This was reality losing consensus. Lyra whispered, "Can we fix this?" Thorn did not answer immediately. Then, "Not if existence is optional." Chapter 25. The Uncomfortable Truth. They argued, not like heroes, like exhausted people. "You can't fight nothing," Kale said. "Fire needs fuel, and flight needs air," Lyra added. "What if it takes that too?" Thorn revealed what he had been avoiding. The null was not an invader. It was a correction, a response to excess reality. Too many worlds, too many branches, too much meaning. The universe at scale was conserving itself. "Reality," Thorn said quietly, "is expensive." Chapter 26. The Question No One Wanted. Who decides what matters? The architects had tried. They failed. Now the cosmos itself was deciding. And it did not value beauty, diversity, or love. It valued efficiency. To resist the null meant to argue that existence was worth the cost, not symbolically, practically. Lyra asked the question none of them wanted to voice. What if we're wrong? Chapter 27. A Smaller Answer. They stopped trying to think like gods. Instead, they listened to ordinary lives. A farmer who chose to plant knowing the harvest might vanish. A teacher who taught history even when memory failed. A couple who loved without certainty of tomorrow. These acts did not scale. They did not solve universes, but they created resistance, meaning localized, persistent. The null slowed. Chapter 28. The Anchor Experiment. Thorn proposed something radical, not more bridges, fewer. Worlds would no longer multiply endlessly. New realities would require investment, choice, commitment, consequence. The seam would no longer promise infinite possibility. It would promise continuity. Kale clenched his fists. People will call that limitation. Yes, Thorn said, and they'll be right. Chapter 29. What it costs to stay the null reacted, not with force, but with pressure. Entire regions thinned. Between-born anchors aged rapidly. Some chose to release their hold. Worlds dimmed. Others held on. Not because they were chosen, but because they chose. Lyra anchored a sky route, knowing she might never fly freely again. Kale bound fire to a coastline, giving up the ability to wander. This was not martyrdom. It was residency. Chapter 30. The Universe Blinks. The null did not retreat. It recalculated. Enough existence proved persistent, not infinite, but sufficient. The subtraction slowed into equilibrium. Some worlds were lost, they were mourned, others stabilized, not perfect, but real. The shape of enough years later, stars still went out. Others were born. No one promised forever anymore. Children learned that reality endured not because it was guaranteed, but because someone stayed when leaving was easier. A child asked Lyra once, older now, grounded by choice. "Will the null come back?" Lyra smiled, tired and honest. "Probably," she said, "but so will we." And across the seam, not infinite, not fragile, existence held. Not because it had to, but because for now, it was worth it. The Net and the Horizon. Chapter 31. The Old Man at the Pier. Long after the stars learned how to go quiet, long after the seam settled into something like habit, there was a fisherman named Iago. He lived on the edge of a small, unnamed world. No one bothered naming it anymore. It was enough that the tides came in, that the nets held fish, that the sky, most days, remembered how to be blue. Iago was not a between-born. He had no wings, no fire, no sense for the in-between. He had hands rough with salt and rope, and a boat that complained when pushed too hard. Every morning he went out before dawn. Every evening he came back. That was the agreement he had made with existence. Chapter 32. Stories as bait. The children gathered when Iago cleaned his nets. They always did. Tell us about before, they asked. Before what? He used to wonder. Before the softening, before the anchors, before the stars that went missing, before when the world was louder. So he told them stories, not the kind scholars liked, not the kind heroes preferred, but the kind that fit inside a small life. He told them about a man who burned like a sunset and chose one shore to protect. He told them about a woman who flew until she learned when to land. He told them about a scholar who loved questions so much he became one. The children listened, wide-eyed. Were they real? One asked. Iago shrugged. Real enough to change how people behave. Chapter 33. When the sea remembers. Some nights, the sea glowed. Not dangerously, not brightly. Just enough to suggest it remembered something warm. Iago would pause then, feeling the hum beneath the waves. He didn't know words like seam or null, but he knew balance. He knew when to pull a net and when to let it drift. The sea, he suspected, had learned the same lesson. Chapter 34. The last lesson. One storm came late in the season, not a catastrophic one, just inconvenient. Boats stayed tied. People waited. A child asked, "Will the world end?" Iago tightened a knot and answered honestly, "Parts of it already have." The child went pale. "But," Iago added, "not the parts we were holding on to." That seemed to satisfy them. Chapter 35. The Truth Finally Small. Iago was old when he stopped fishing. Too old to trust the tides, too tired to argue with the wind. On his last morning at the pier, one of the children, grown now, asked him softly, "Do you think those stories mattered?" Iago looked out at the horizon, at a line where sea met sky, and neither tried to erase the other. "Yes," he said, "they taught us how much was enough. What remains? No monuments were built, no final battles recorded. The seam did not sing, it simply held. Worlds continued. Some ended. Most were lived in. And on a quiet shore, an old fisherman's stories were passed along, changing slightly each time, as all good truths do. Not about saving everything, but about staying. If you liked this story of worlds, seams, and ordinary lives holding extraordinary weight, subscribe for more stories. There are always more horizons.